What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my bag of clay. I'm going to then grab our wire tool. And then I'm going to cut this. Easiest way to cut this, right, is to choose a section, maybe about yay big. Make sure you're not cutting the bag in half. Maybe about yay big. What I like to do is take that, stand it up. And then what you want to try to do is cut it into squares, because you want to start with something round. If you start with a square, it's a little easier to make round. A thing that a lot of students have a tendency to do is like cut off a super flat piece like this and then try to make it round. What you end up doing is trapping a bunch of air inside, and that's going to mess you up the whole rest of the process, right? So we want to avoid that. But if you start with a square, and this is like a decent amount of clay, I would guess like roughly 2 pounds, right? We do have a scale over here. I do kind of recommend, as you first start throwing, start weighing how much clay you're using. That will give you sort of a mental image of how much height you should be able to get out of it. So something that's 2 pounds, I can make like a decent sized bowl out of. If I'm just making cups, where it's like we're starting as cylinders, right? It's one of the trickier, but also like the most quintessential parts of ceramics is being able to throw a cylinder, because most of what we make is a cylinder that we then turn into something else, right? We're making a vase, starts as a cylinder. Most bowls start as like a kind of rounded cylinder. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my roughly pound and a half size piece of clay, and I'm going to sort of smack it into a like round or potato shape, right? Like roughly baseball size is what you guys should be shooting for. Double check your wheel, should be spinning counterclockwise, right? Very important. So I'm going to take that. My hands are dry when I do this because I don't want this all sloppy, right? My bat has been dampened, but it's not soaking wet. So I'm going to set that like that, dry my hand off, put it in the middle. I put like a decent amount of pressure on there, but I wasn't like, whoa! I didn't go crazy with it, right? I put it in the middle, then I give it 2 firm smacks. The reason we do this is clay has a tendency, if there's any water underneath, or like say you trapped an air bubble in there when you were smacking it, you put a lot of pressure on it in the centering process, and sometimes it has a tendency to like and shoot off at people. We're gonna try to avoid anyone getting like clobbered in the dome with a like pound and a half piece of clay, right? So the 2 smacks is really really helpful for that. The next thing I like to do to sort of ensure we're not like shooting at people, right, is I take a middle finger and I, at a 45-degree angle, kind of smear this bottom corner. Can you guys see that on the video? In there, that kind of just like really seals it to the wheel head, right? So first part of centering, or first part of clay, really in general on the wheel, is centering. I can do this pretty fast. You can see like this sort of works like a car, like forward and then off. It kind of has a cruise control setting. So a lot of times I'll find a speed that's good for me, and I'll just take my foot off and let it do its thing. Because beginners especially have a tendency to, the more pressure they put on, the faster their legs go into, and we want to try to avoid that. That can mess you up. So what I'll do, I still do it, and I'm like, why is this? Oh yeah, no, I'm doing the thing. So what I'm going to do, when I'm centering, I go pretty fast, right? So I'm just going to let that be as fast as it can go. Anytime you touch clay, you want wet clay, wet hands, right? And I also always want the wheel to be spinning before I go to touch it. Otherwise, it has a tendency to sort of throw a weird wobble into it. And the whole beginning part of this process is just getting rid of all this back and forth wobble, right? So the way I do that, it's called the chair karate chop method. What I do is I make like sort of an L with my left hand, like a little chair shape, and then my right hand makes a karate chop. I wedge my left elbow into my body. If you guys are sitting, it's a little bit easier. You can sort of wedge into your waist area, right? But I'm just gonna, because I'm standing up, wedge into my sort of belly area. I come at this at maybe, this is 6, so maybe 7 o'clock, right? With the chair, and the chair pushes in, and the karate chop pushes down. What we're trying to do basically is make a jig with our hands, a jig that's this shape. Apply enough pressure to the clay that the clay doesn't move our hands, but our hands move the clay. Does that make sense? And so, let's start off again. If I'm doing that way out here and I don't have anything wedged into my body, it's real easy for this to happen. But if I'm wedged in, instead of using all arm strength to do something, I can kind of just wedge into myself and lean forward. And then I'm using all my body weight instead of trying to exert like 200 pounds of force via my arms. Does that make sense? So a lot of this is just back and forth with the wedged into your body sort of chair and karate chop. Trying to get it into the very, very center where there's no more wiggle. Which we did there. right? So what we're shooting for here is like roughly hockey puck shape / size. You know what I mean? It'll be a little bit bigger depending on how much clay you have. So that's the first step, centering. Much easier looking than it is. The next step is dropping the well. So basically, we're making a cylinder, right? Cylinder's got an opening in it, so we got to start with an opening. So what I do is I take finger guns, right? Just like this. And the very first thing I do is I kind of, with a tiny bit of pressure from the top, push forward. And can you see I've got like this little baby ridge that's happening here? What I'm trying to do is keep pushing that forward. That ridge will make sort of a like weird nubbin, you know what I mean? And I keep pushing past that nubbin, and it'll want to make like a little divot. Right where that divot is the very middle, right? It's really important to find the very middle before we make an opening. Reason being, if I just sort of willy-nilly guess where the middle is and make an opening, I'll have a super thick side, and I'll have a super thin side. That's going to lead to one side of my wall that's really tall, and the other that's very short. So starting in the very center is very important, right? So that's a little trick to help you find center. Go there, and it also just gives yourself like a little lubrication reservoir, right? And then a place for your fingers to sit. So I take those same finger guns, right in the very center there. And I don't know if you guys noticed too, anytime I touch the clay, my hands sort of act as one tool. You know what I mean? Almost like when I'm doing the karate chop chair thing, like they're acting in unison, right? It's like a jig. Same thing happens here. When I'm opening, my two hands are touching each other. My hands are steadied on the actual splash pan, or they can be steadied on my legs or my stomach, right? And I'm going to push down at a 45-degree angle until I get the very tip of my finger right here to where I guess roughly like a 1/4 inch would be. That's like the classic pottery thickness is roughly a 1/4 inch. Gives you some room to trim if you need to. It's also thin enough that if you don't trim, your pot doesn't weigh like 200 pounds, right? I don't know if you guys can tell, like it's really shiny on the outside here. It's really dull and kind of matte on the inside here. That means that I was running out of lubrication, and so it's starting to drag on my fingers. That has a tendency to make your fingers kind of and skip, and it also has a tendency to throw things out of whack. So, like I said in the beginning, you always want wet clay, you always want wet hands. So what I'm going to do is just sort of get that shiny again, and then I know my fingers can kind of just skate here without any issue. You know what I mean? So, gauging that like 1/4 inch thickness, like I told you to shoot for, is kind of tricky, especially in the beginning. So this is one of the only times in this whole process that I stop the wheel. And I'm going to get this going dead stop. And this is a really good tool for checking the thickness. What I do is I poke in the very bottom, and then I follow my tool down to where my fingernail touches the clay. I then like hold firm, and I pull it out, and that's roughly how thick my bottom is, right? Which is like a little bit more than a 1/4 inch, which is fine with me because I can do some trimming later, right? Downside is now we've got like a big hole in the bottom of our pot. Luckily, clay is like pretty amorphous. So to seal that up, all I do is that sort of same finger gun from the corner thing, down towards the middle, and that'll seal that bad boy up. And so right now, I don't know if you guys can see, it's got sort of almost like flying saucer-y kind of V shape to it, right? And a cylinder is flat, or it's like straight up and down, flat, and then straight up and down, right? So I have to make this sort of V shape that's going on the inside flat. The way I do that is I take my finger gun down in my very middle part, and I flip it sideways, and then I make kind of a claw like this. I make a claw, two hands always touching each other, always steadied on something. Make a claw and pull that towards myself slowly. And you can see it's starting to get dry there, right? So I'm going to stop, add some more lubrication, and then keep pulling. Pull out to roughly how big you want the center diameter to be, right? So all I did there was take that V shape and sort of make it flat on the bottom. The next step is I got some like sort of like weird wibbledy-woos from when I was trying to pull it flat. Like your fingers aren't like a great tool for that. So the next step is going to be compressing this to make sure it's super flat. And also what that does is all the sort of molecules that are in clay are all hexagonal. When you squish them, they have a tendency to sit on top of each other like this. Then when you squish them, they have a tendency to sort of interlock like this and become much stronger, right? So compressing is always super important. It'll prevent you from getting cracks in the bottom of your piece. So like spend some extra time doing this, and it also helps you refine that sort of flat bottom shape, right? All I'm doing there is just with a sponge in hand, applying enough pressure to sort of squish it, but not so much pressure that I'm gouging through down to the wheel head, right? And you can see like it's a pretty nice corner that we've got situated here now, right? Like a little bit better looking than we had just a second ago. All right, the next step, ceramics is funny in that there's so much centrifugal force going around all the time that if you try to make a cylinder, you'll end up with a bowl. If you try to make a bowl, you'll end up with a weird plate that falls over on itself. So what we need to do is shoot more inward than cylinder, so we're going to shoot for volcano shape. If we try to do this, inevitably, like centrifugal force and the fact that your head's kind of off to the right when you're pulling and doing stuff, you'll end up with a cylinder. So always shoot for more narrow than you actually need, because you can always make things wider. It's really easy to make things wide. It's very difficult to make things that are wide skinny again, right? So what we need to do, like the bottom's flat here, right? But if you look down here, this side's still kind of like V-shaped, right? Which is not what we want. So I do get rid of that, is I basically pinch a sponge in between my thumb and my middle finger. And then from the back, I sort of brace the inside here so it doesn't get all wibbly-wobbly on me. And I kind of basically make like a little wall here, and I'm going to press that wall into the piece. I'm going to do that through my sponge as like a lubrication barrier though, right? So I'm just doing this. All I'm trying to do is take that V shape and turn it into more of a volcano shape, because that will make every other step a little bit easier, right? So realistically, so you guys can see on camera, all I was doing was this, but with a sponge in my finger. Does that make sense? And I do a lot of stuff kind of pinching a sponge, because clay has a tendency, the more pressure you use, to get drier and drier, and then it'll start to drag. That can really mess you up if you're in the middle of something, right? But if you do that with a sponge in your hands, it doesn't dry out quite as quickly. All right. Also, always make sure the inside of your piece doesn't have a bunch of water sitting in it, right? A lot of people's pieces have a tendency to look like this. Ceramics is interesting in that you need water to do anything, but if you leave water in there too long, it's going to ruin your piece because it weakens the wall of the clay. So a lot of what we do is like add a bunch of water, do the thing you want to do, get rid of all the water that you added, right? So I did the add a bunch of water stage. So now what we're going to do is called pulling. I do my first couple pulls, again with that same like thumb, middle finger thing in here. The concept here is I have one finger on the outside, one finger on the inside. I usually do this at, if I'm here, my hands are usually at like, I don't know, like 4:30, right? Roughly here. Two hands acting in unison, almost like one of those like claw machines that like grab stuff, right? And I squeeze these together, and then I rise up slowly. And again, I'm trying to imagine myself pulling into a volcano shape, because eventually I'm going to end up with a cylinder if I shoot for that, right? So what that looks like with the sponge reservoir. These are touching. I squeeze them together. And then I rise up slowly with it. I ease off on the pressure as I get towards the top. And then I sort of let go really gently. What I really try to imagine is happening, especially towards the top, because people have a tendency to like push, 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 push. You'll get to the top and your finger will sort of slide over. Once I get to here, I really am barely putting any pressure on, right? And then when I let go, I like to imagine myself as like a jellyfish. You know what I mean? Like jellyfish don't ever like stop and rip away. Like anything a jellyfish is trying to get away from, it goes here and it's kind of like... But that's really helpful, because if I'm here and I move away quickly, the clay sticks to my hands and throws everything off center, right? So you always want to come in very gently, and you want to jellyfish away. So those first, this is called a pull, right? What we did there basically is pull clay from the bottom corner here up into the height. So I added water, so I'm going to go in and remove all that water. Then I'm going to add that water again so that I can do the next step. And you guys can see like my wheel's not going full speed right now, right? A really important thing to note is it's not even super important how fast this is going. How fast this is going in relativity to your hands is very important. If this was going really fast, I can do all these steps really quickly because it rotates around more, right? The RPMs are higher. Because this is sort of a medium speed, I want to be pulling up at a medium speed. If I don't, I'll end up with like a weird spiral through my clay because my hands and the wheel speed aren't in unison. Does that make sense? That'll make more sense too, I think, as you guys start to sort of get situated.
You don't see me, I'm just your magician's assistant.
Thank you. That's going to be great in the video. All right, so I'm going to do one more pull. Again, sort of squeezing in at the bottom corner here. And then I'm rising up slowly. Really trying to imagine I'm pulling up into a volcano shape. I get towards the top. I'm barely putting any pressure here.
Jellyfish.
Jellyfish away, right? And then after each one of those pulls, what I like to do is I take a little pinch here, make sure my hands are lubricated. And I kind of do like a mini chair karate chop by like pinching, and then the top comes down here. You do that to ensure your lip on this stays kind of fat and rounded. Otherwise, it has a tendency to get real razor thin and split apart, right? So we're gonna do maybe one more of these sponge pulls. I usually call these like muscle pulls because I'm using a lot more pressure than I'm going to in just a second. That said, if you compare this to the pressure you use when you're centering, it's like barely any. When you center, you gotta really like go at it, right? This part, like even when you're using a lot of pressure, you're not using that much pressure. Folks have a tendency to like keep that same kind of pressure gauge that they were using before when they were centering, and they'll just like rip the piece in half, right? So this is like, the whole thing is kind of a dainty process, and it gets daintier and daintier sort of the taller your piece gets, right? So then I'll come in here, and I can feel much better without the sponge in my hands, but once I get some of that clay up, I'll come in here and I'll just do the pulls with just my middle fingers, right? 2 hands acting in unison, and I'm pulling up slowly. You guys can kind of see, it kind of makes these like tree rings, right? And they're nice and they're even. That's how I know I'm doing a good pull. I get towards the top, I ease up from the pressure, jellyfish away. So from here, I've got sort of our like basic mug shape, right? It's still kind of volcano shaped, which is good because I can always make it a little bit wider if I need to. But this is also a good time to use any of my tools that I have. So say I like this shape, but I don't want it to go in quite so much, or I want it to be more straight and not have this curve that it has going. I can use the flat side of my rib here to aid. I'll scrape some of that like skirt clay off the bottom. We call it like the skirt because it sort of flares out like that. I'm gonna do this, and all I'm doing here is just keeping this straight up and down. My inside finger on the clay is sort of just pressing the clay against this. This sort of acts the same as the compression that we did on the bottom, in that it'll make our clay stronger. It can be thin but still strong. Does that make sense? Because we kind of squished it all into be its like most advanced self. So we're gonna set this here, and I'm gonna push the inside clay against it. And you can see it's like scraping a lot of that goopy stuff off the sides, because my piece is starting to get much more matte, right? And if you go down, like all I basically did there was straighten out that curve a little bit, so it's kind of just like slowly but surely scrape all the goop off and do some shaping, right? This is also a time you could do any like designs you wanted to do. Like if you look at this bone dry piece I have there, there's a bunch of swirlies in it. I did that on this stage while it was spinning, just kind of went like whatever sort of floats your boat, right? I'm just gonna leave this kind of simple because I like the kind of modern, simple aesthetic that we're going for here. Mop out some of the water from the inside. You never want to leave water in there. Then I'm gonna take my wooden knife, and then I'm going to, I still have some skirt clay here. Like I was saying before, this bottom corner is gonna be really hard for you guys to not have a bunch of extra clay in, right? We are gonna trim these, but what I like to do first is I take my wooden knife, almost like I was like chopping carrots with it, right? Sharp side being here. And I flip it like fully upside down like this, get it moist. And then I'll come down here, really firm hands, really firm grip on this. I'll cut into the clay and basically just give myself less work to do when I'm trimming, right? Just trying to cut off some of that skirt so that it's not quite so heavy. Once we do that, we basically made a little moat that I then have to fill with water. Once it's filled with water, it'll come off real easy. So while it's spinning, I'll just sort of scrape underneath and it'll jump off. If you don't do the water step, when you do that, it'll jump up onto your pot, right? The water makes it slide away. So now we just kind of come in here, reevaluate the shape, see if I like this or not. The bottom third of a pot's not super important if you're gonna trim it, because we're gonna totally adjust that later on, right? The next step is let it dry to the point where it's like not quite so goopy and hard to work with, and then we'll like go in with some sharp tools and really refine, right? So this I think is like a good enough shape for me. I want it to be relatively straight. It's got a little bit of an undercut here, which is good. It means it'll have a little bit of lift when it's finished. So the last step I do, if I want this to be a drinking vessel, is I come in, and right now it's got like a really rounded lip, right? Which is fine for like a bowl or like even like a stein or something, you know what I mean? But for like a coffee mug or something you're gonna drink wine out of, you've got corners in your mouth, and round things don't fit very well there, and they have a tendency to dribble. So what I'm gonna do is just come in. What's that? Yeah, right. Yeah, especially if it's been a couple, right? What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do that same kind of pinchy thing here. Instead of coming down flat with my like mini karate chop, I come in at an angle, and this will just give it just a slight bit of sharpness there, to where when you drink from it, the corner will fit in your mouth and it'll drink so much better. Like when you go home, pay attention to how your cups are. Especially if you have any handmade cups, I can't use something that's got like a square or a round top now because I pay too close attention to it. So I'll do that. I'll come and check out what I did to the lip when I did it. Maybe spend like another minute or two doing some shaping. Maybe refine that drinking edge. And then we'll call it. That's the throwing process, right? Oh, well, thank you. Well, thank you.
And you made that look very
He
cool.
did.
Let me grab my wire tool real quick. So, say you have this, right? You haven't gotten any bats yet because you weren't listening to Tyler when he said go buy a bunch of bats. One of the ways you can get this off is to squeeze a bunch of water all over. And you should cut under this regardless, even if this is your bat, because you want it to release easier, right? Take your piano wire, push it down flat as much as you can. I usually go through this twice. I'll usually squish this off to the side. This has a tendency to oval things, which I don't love, which is why I recommend everybody gets their own bat, right? I'll then basically set this in a way where I can move it onto something else. And now if this was just like one of these pieces of wearboard, right, I could then take this and put it on my shelf and it would be fine, and the studio would still have this bat if the next class needed it, right? Does that make sense? Anybody have any questions?
Do you let it sit in that much water when you move it? Or I guess the
Always, yeah. If I want to do this sort of thing where it skates off, you have to have this sort of a ton of water.
I mean, at that point, when you move it, well, I guess,
Are you gonna dry it a little?
are you going to on the bottom? It's still,
No, I'm going to leave this.
It's still so wet on the bottom.
Yeah, it's still super wet on the bottom, but just like the whole thing is super wet, so it kind of doesn't matter that much, right? But it's on something, it wouldn't be on plastic traditionally, right? This would be on something porous. So it would be absorbing moisture the whole time there too. Does that make sense? Some people will do this where they like cut it and they just grab it. I find that to be a nightmare. I don't know how people do that all the time. If you leave your pot really thick, you can do that, but if you throw relatively thin, like your pot will just collapse in your hands. So I find this to be the easiest way to transfer from one thing to another. Realistically, go get yourself some bats, because then all I would have to do is cut it, take my bat off, and set it on my shelf. And like I don't have to fuss with it, right? That's the easiest, best way to do it. A little bit more costly. Bats cost like anywhere from like $8 to $12 each, right? But for like $30 to not struggle every time you throw something, it's like well worth it. Okay?
So if you had your own bat, yes, you cut it, but do you have to move it to the
Nope,
side?
you just cut it, take the whole bat off, put it on your shelf, put your next bat down. It's 1,000 times easier. I highly recommend everyone do it, right? As someone who's been doing this for like forever, I don't do this moving thing. I think it's real dumb, but like I understand that it's kind of a necessity when you don't have like a big backstock of bats, right? You mess up more pieces when you do this than you don't. You know what I mean? If this was a bowl, no way I'm moving it, right? If it's a plate, no way I'm moving it. So it's just like beneficial to get a couple. Does that make sense? Cool. Does anyone have any other questions about the demo?
How thin can you make the sidewalls?
You can make them real thin, right? The thinner you make it, the more floppy it is, and it has a tendency to oval more. Like if you look at this top down, it actually did oval a little bit as I was moving it, because it is relatively thin. If it was like a real thick boy, it wouldn't have any oval to it, right? But you can get it like pretty paper thin. It's hard to do without it like sort of collapsing on itself, but it's possible. I wouldn't be shooting for that in a beginner class. I would just be shooting for consistency. Your pot can be thick, so long as it's the same thickness everywhere, right? Like thinness, a lot of people associate with like, oh, that's thrown well. That's not the case. Consistent and even walls mean that you did a good job. Okay? Cool. All right, kids. Yeah, find yourself a wheel, get situated. Does everyone have their clay? Everyone's got their shelf. We're all set up? Right on, go for it.